Depending on who you ask, E3 is either an exploitative parade of corrupt, abusive companies dangling their keys in front of willing consumers in order to pad out their next bonus, or it's WrestleMania for video games. And while both can and often are true, E3 season simply doesn't hit like it used to. Thanks to that small apocalypse from last year, the traditional assembly of the great and the sweaty from around the world of games never descended upon Los Angeles. Instead, they stayed at home and set up elaborate Google calendars in a vain attempt to keep track of the sheer volume of microconferences that sprung up in E3's wake. Now a year on, and with signs of normality returning, there's probably going to be an in-person E3 next year, in which journalists, developers and publishers can band together all to get heatstroke in the middle of Los Angeles. While that format is dated and has definitely shown its age in recent years, the alternative we've found ourselves with is terrible. Hyper-controlled messages, a ridiculous number of times and dates to keep a track of, and a complete lack of unity that E3 brought with it. However artificial that actually was. I just want to spend 1 week getting excited, staying up till 5 in the morning watching E3 press conferences. That's what E3 is to me, and I think it is for a lot of other people too. E3 could be better, and here's how. In order to understand how we got to this current, bewildering mess of a show, it's probably worth going back 200 years to 1995 and discussing the history of the event. The Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 for short, or the Electronic Triple if you're cool, has been the dominant force in gaming trade shows for over 2 decades. Sure, other shows have had larger attendance numbers, and it could have been argued in the past that Tokyo Game Show was more of a powerhouse, but E3 has maintained its place as the mecca for games ever since its inception. Originally it spawned from CES when those refrigerator salesmen decided that they didn't want no damn video games. While they didn't actually say that directly, the way they treated games did that for them. Then CEO of Sega of America Tom Kalinske wrote, "The CES organisers used to put the video game industry way in the back. In 1991 they put us in a tent and you had to walk past all the porn vendors to find us. That particular year it was pouring rain and the rain leaked right over our new Genesis system. I was just furious with the way that CES treated the video game industry, and I felt we were a more important industry than they were giving us credit for." The original E3 was held in 1995, 1 month before I was born. That's right, E3 is older than me, and look at the state of me. While the original E3 was very stuffy and full of men in business suits and GameStop managers, it eventually attracted more and more attention as the years went on. With the rise of gaming press in both print and especially on the internet, E3 developed a mythos around it as this glorious week in June in which new consoles, video games and even more would be shown off. Although in the early days of E3, the average person who enjoyed games could only ever experience the show through a blog post or the odd photo of the show floor. It seemed like a magical place where all the world's unreleased video games lived together. To go to E3 was a goal for many, including myself. The main events of the show were the press conferences. Spectacular PowerPoint presentations that could range from trailers for games that would never release and The Rock shilling the original Xbox to literal graphs and announcements about which games were being added to the PSP's greatest hits line. Really? The early days of the press conferences were far from the highly produced, well-trained performances they are today, but they still held the most exciting announcements of all. Actually watching them though, that was a different story. Video on the internet in this time was in its infancy, certainly outside of places like the United States, and if you did somehow have internet strong enough to download a video, you were going to use that on something like John Cena's entrance from Here Comes the Pain, not some hour-long video of a man in a business suit telling you about sales projections. The idea of streaming the entire conference live, well, that was so far in the future it might as well have been Blade Runner. It was laughable. While footage of the early E3s is difficult to come by, GameSpot made a documentary about the process of covering the show in the mid-2000s. While the production is dated, it gives a great feel of the ideal E3. Games everywhere, rushing around desperate to be the first person to play something that wouldn't be out for months. The documentary also gives insight into what it was actually like to cover the show from the press. with writers running from appointment to appointment, editors desperately trying to get the first coverage of a game up, and the late great Ryan Davis physically running a tape of the press conference across town in order to have it online. The sheer amount of effort that was being put into something that can all be literally done from a phone now is a testament to how quickly the industry and the show has changed. E3 would only grow in popularity and notoriety. With the rise of YouTube and democratized online video, companies would begin polishing their conferences to be well-produced mini musicals full of hyper-edited trailers, paid clappers, and the kind of people that talk like they're trying to convince you to drink poison. The new era of conference really dawned when Microsoft began broadcasting their yearly show on television. The dull, business-focused presentations were gone in favour of Elijah Wood and wearing a t-shirt under a blazer. You can't really get away with this sort of thing when you're trying to hold the attention of an audience that would just as quickly flick over to Rob Dyrdek's Dislocation Factory. Although saying that, the last time they actually bothered to show up to E3, Sony pulled this. So maybe things haven't changed as much as I think. While these conferences were often extremely cringy, look up an E3 cringe comp if you want to spend the next few days recoiling in horror at the likes of Jamie Kennedy and this Donnie from a recent EA event.
I am here to talk about Need for Speed Payback. If you guys didn't know, Need for Speed Payback,
It felt like the levels of hype among the audience was only going up. These were the days before I was in the industry and was simply a fan, but I remember the 2013 Sony press conference where they took a big shite on Microsoft's recently announced and widely mocked Xbox One policies like it was yesterday. Go to that video on YouTube and you'll see comments from people saying things like, "This is when Sony won the generation," and I remember watching this, it gave me chills. Companies were fully playing into the idiotic but absolutely addictive tribalism that gaming had developed. That tribalism was always there, but the rise of social media seemed to pour fuel on top of it and then throw a couple of Molotovs on for good measure. Conferences were changing based on things that happened in conferences earlier that day. There was an electricity on the ground in Los Angeles. You wanted to be a part of it. This corresponded with the explosion of online video thanks to places such as YouTube. A large portion of that was focused on gaming. Now, no matter where you were in the world, you could keep up with E3 as if you were there. I remember sitting literally hundreds of thousands of miles away in Paisley, but I felt like I was there with everyone else watching the show. This was helped by the explosion in the number of people reacting to the conferences live and posting their reactions on YouTube. Watching the conferences was a shared experience, even if you didn't have someone to actually watch it with. Earlier I mentioned WrestleMania, and that wasn't by accident. If you're not cursed with the affliction of liking wrestling, WrestleMania is a yearly event that usually takes place in April. Think of it as the season finale for wrestling each year. Storylines are concluded, new ones begin, and it feels like a big payoff for the year you've slogged through. As such, when these things are done correctly, they're the most powerful shows of the year. It makes my remaining hair stand on end thinking about things like Daniel Bryan winning the world title or the Hardy Boys returning after years away. It, like E3, takes place in America, and as such, for fans in Scotland, it means staying up all night to watch. Getting your WrestleMania snacks is such a tradition you can literally go to Asda on the night of the event and see exactly who else is in your position gearing up for the long haul. When it finishes at 5 or 6 in the morning, if it's been good, I can't sleep. I feel like all I want to do is experience more, to talk to other fans about it, to hear the reactions from people that I follow that cover wrestling, to see the videos on the ground as things happened, to hear those pops again. That's what E3 was. It was gaming WrestleMania, or at least it was until a few years ago. Modern E3 is a bit all over the place. You see, the thing is, as technology moved forward and companies began to realise that they could handle the announcements of products in-house without the ESA and without the stress of having to perform something live, more and more of them stopped showing up and instead produced pre-recorded messages that they could easily press play on. Nintendo was the first to do this with their Nintendo Directs. Whilst usually taking place during E3 week, they were no longer in a big auditorium like the glory days. Instead, they were tightly edited video packages. You know, I've always found it strange how because of things like E3, executives and people at companies that were never supposed to be front-facing figures suddenly become big stars. but E3 made it so that having a good frontman was a necessity, or in Nintendo's case, frontmen, with Reggie Fils-Aimé, Shigeru Miyamoto, and the late great Satoru Iwata forming a powerful triple threat that catapulted them not only to faces of the company, but stars of the show. I don't think you'd get a Paramount presentation in which John Paramount is turned into a puppet. Around this time is also when juggernauts Activision and EA would pull out of the show floor. Surrendering booth space that was once hard thought over, neither of these titans of the industry caring about having games on the show floor was a big shock at the time, while EA would hold their own event in the same week across the street called EA Play with mixed results. The exodus from the show floor was just another sign of E3 losing its relevance. The week of E3 obviously still held some clout. For one, when else are all the world's gaming press and a good few mainstream reporters going to be in one place? Hence why EA Play took place in E3 week, but very specifically didn't have to pay the ESA for the privilege. There was a clear shift to consumer-focused events. It's no accident that this all happened around the rise of games as a service, a model that is designed to have players tied to one game for years, spending time and money repeatedly. Sure, EA could be part of E3 where their game is placed alongside hundreds of others, but what they want is for a FIFA fan to tune in exclusively to EA Play, sign up for their service, engage with their microtransactions, and above all, evangelize to their friends about EA's games. It was extremely territorial and it's only gotten more so. People have limited time and these companies want it all. The days of spreadsheets seemed like 100 years ago, when events for the new Battlefield would end with 60 playable demos lining the hall for attendees, a large number of whom were no longer press or even members of the industry. They were just fans. Acknowledging this move towards focusing on consumers instead of trade, and realising that E3 still held huge cultural cachet with the people that had been following games for years, the ESA decided, rather hastily, to do something that always ends up leaving things in a worse state than they were before. They invited the public. The first public E3 was... well, I think this clip from a friend of the me, Hamish Black, for his amazing channel Writing on Games, sums it up perfectly.
So E3 has kind of seen this decline coming, and in a bid to maintain the reputation as the #1 gaming convention thing, they've opened the doors to any person who's willing to pay the $250 price tag, giving publishers a reason to come back to the show. So the downside, according to a bunch of industry vets, is that nothing about the way the show has been laid out has changed to accommodate the 15,000 extra people coming through the doors. I mean, there were reports on day one that they had to open the show early because the people queuing out on the street was considered a hazard. I mean, that is kind of wild.
That said, E3 has always been about the experience over all else for me. The idea of going to the conference in this transition year to end all transition years excited me far more than the prospect of just playing unreleased games. Me being the masochist that I am, I was super into experiencing that chaos firsthand. Little did I know, however, that what would greet us would be something this bad. A convention entirely unequipped to deal with the extra bodies being dumped on it, an ESA entirely ignorant to the real problems that was causing, all culminating in a show that had me and many others asking the question, how could this possibly be a worthwhile experience for a paying public?
They were so ill prepared to stuff this absolute mass of humanity into the show that they had to open it early. Soon after, another problem arose. What were people supposed to do? If you don't know, even in the days before the public was allowed in, you didn't just go into E3 and have all the games in the world laid out for you to get a shot of. The weeks and months leading up to the show were dedicated to press organising and booking in slots for behind closed doors demos, interviews, and crucially, getting invited to the press conferences, none of which was available to the public. That's right, the thing that you associate E3 with the most, the press conferences, were always invite only, and the public weren't invited. This led to reports of people standing around aimlessly, waiting in line for hours to play games that had already come out, and it caused many in the media to ask, why had they even bothered coming? Of course, the allure of E3 is going to still be there, but what were they actually getting for their money? Was it the chance to shop in the E3 merch store, or the chance to shop in the E3 merch store. Public-focused gaming shows have been a thing for a long time. Events like PAX, EGX and Insomnia are built with the idea that they're mainly focused on the public. Sure, there will be a few new games to play if you fancy lining up, but the experience is centered around consumers. The first public E3 felt like they just left the back door open and let anyone run in for the low price of a Nintendo Switch, and didn't consider what that would actually do to the show. As press, getting from appointment to appointment at the show was already a nightmare when the only people you were competing with were other journalists, some devs, and some GameStop managers. Even in those days, some absolute hashheads would sprint around as if they're running to the front of a barrier at a concert, but now with the public, this footage looks like something you'd see at Black Friday, not an industry event. Since people had nothing to do other than wait or not get into press conferences, events started popping up that catered to the idea of an audience that would happily sit and do just about anything other than bake in the sun. IGN and GameSpot had hosted live shows for years, but now they were a place for actual in-person attendees to go and watch the demos as opposed to, you know, watching them on a stream at home like everyone else who didn't pay $250. Although the argument remained that it was the one time of the year that Sony and Microsoft stood side by side, sometimes literally thanks to where their booths were positioned, to show the industry what they have to release for the next year, 2 years, or maybe never. Sure, Nintendo didn't actually do a presentation at the show anymore, but have you seen the size of their booths? It'll be fine, don't worry about it, the show is fine. E3's fine. E3 is fine.
PlayStation will not host an E3 press conference or appear at E3 2019.
That is
When you click on the article, it's getting article not found under construction. What?
What? That's fucking huge.
This can't be real. What?
After almost 25 years, 4 generations of consoles and $599, Sony announced that it would not have a presence at E3 2019, ending a relationship that spanned as far back as the inception of the event itself. This sent shockwaves around the industry. People started literally crying and burning their PS4s, and while that is a lie, it was the clearest sign that something was changing in the world of how games companies disseminated information. In a statement given to Polygon, which wasn't said by Jim Ryan, but let's pretend it was just so I can do the voice. As the industry evolves, Sony Interactive Entertainment continues to look for inventive opportunities to engage the community. PlayStation fans mean the world to us, and we'll always want to innovate, think differently, and experiment with new ways to delight gamers. As a result, we have decided not to participate in E3 2019. We are exploring new and familiar ways to engage our community in 2019, and we can't wait to share our plans with you. So obviously that means basically nothing, but they couldn't really say, yeah, we don't need the show anymore, people will watch our streams regardless, because there was still a chance that they'd need to come back and be pals with the ESA. Obviously, as of writing this hasn't happened, and instead Sony has focused on its own state of play streams for information, including the announcement and the release date of the PS5. E3 2019 wasn't a total bin fire, however. The other big conferences happened and retained that E3 feel, including this, in retrospect, hilarious Keanu Reeves moment. Jeff Keighley hosted the E3 Coliseum, which was a way for bored fans to have something to do other than get sunstroke waiting in line to play Fortnite, and for the most part, it seemed like a normal, modern E3, which was a regular, if diminished, show. Despite many saying that E3 was dying and becoming a pointless show, there was still some value to it. Indie developers had a chance to meet with publishers that could make career-changing deals. Journalists who only knew each other from the internet managed to network and make lifelong friends. And for the fans, they still got to go to E3. Sure, it wasn't the E3 they thought of when they were 13, but they still got to play some of the biggest games in the world a bit earlier than everyone else. As long as nothing else happened, the ESA could have built on E3 2019 to make E3 2020 a great show for consumers, publishers, developers, and the press. Wait, why are you playing that music? Yes, and what could only be described as a fuck-up of such epic proportions that it was visible from the International Space Station, the ESA doxed over 2,000 journalists, YouTubers and streamers with personal information such as email addresses and actual addresses sitting out in the open on an easily accessible website. It's quite difficult to imagine anything that could have tanked the perception of E3 any more widely in the press than literally putting them in danger. The gaming press are already in an unfortunate position because they get paid pennies to give opinions on toys that may or may not get them death threats. So basically handing that group information that could be at the very best used to intimidate and frighten, and at the worst could be used to track down and murder someone, the ESA evaporated any trust they might have had. In response to this, the ESA told Kotaku, ESA was made aware of a website vulnerability that led to the contact list of registered journalists attending E3 being made public. Once notified, we immediately took steps to protect the data and shut down the site, which is no longer available. We regret this occurrence and have put measures in place to ensure it will not happen again. To this day, there has basically been no contrition or explanation from the ESA as to how this happened, how they plan to make it better, and how they could compensate journalists. They literally risked people's lives. It's not an overstatement to say that. Publish a contentious review on a big site and then read the comments. Tell me if you'd want those people knowing where you live. E3's magical 2019 would only continue a few months later when leaked plans revealed the ESA's guide to turning the event into a quote fan, media and influencer festival. In a document obtained by Game Daily, the ESA outlined what it hoped would be a way for the event to hold more cultural cachet by transitioning into more of a PAX or San Diego Comic-Con. The pitch deck included plans to lean into influencer and paid celebrity appearances. One example included members of the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team playing NBA 2K on the show floor or competing in a tournament, not unlike the recent Fortnite Pro-Ams. This would take place on the show floor thanks to a completely reimagined floor plan. Game Daily compared the leaked configuration to that of E3 2018's West Hall show floor. As you can see, at this gaming trade show, the games are pushed off to the side, while 8 experiences are given prominence. In a statement that I will try to read without being sick on camera, the lobby group stated that it wanted to create exclusive/appointment only activations for select attendees who will create buzz and FOMO. If you've not got worms in your brain, FOMO means fear of missing out. It's like a marketing buzz term that's used by pricks. Research shows that millennials and Gen Z are the most giving back/social good generations ever. By amplifying E3 as a social good brand, we can advance the industry's brand with consumers while storing positive chits for future use, e.g. policy goals, next negative video game story, or when you release the private information of 2,000 people. One tactic we can implement is partnering with influencers, celebrities, athletes, YouTube personalities who are passionate about E3 relevant social good efforts, e.g. gender inequality and STEM. Imagine an NBA global champion. It says imagine shouldn't it be imagine an? Anyway, imagine an NBA global superstar participating in E3 Coliseum conversation and or global movie star being part of the E3 digital ticket because it included a social good component. So instead of making the show a better show for consumers by, giving them more opportunities to play unreleased games or cool sit-down interviews with developers like something you'd see at EGX, some of the ESA were proposing that people attending the show would rather have some 10th string Laker playing Fortnite because they'd give money to save the rainforest or something. That can't have been real. To say the proposal was roundly mocked would be like saying that leaking the information of 2,000 journalists was a bit of a PR issue.
Kawhi Leonard to play Bill Lambert's combat basketball with the fans.
But see, okay, there you go.
But they've got this proposed.
I would hate to miss out on that.
They've got
the ESA's commitment to fucking up 2019 was honestly Hall of Fame worthy. You lose one of the biggest attractions to your show. The people that did pay to go to the show have nothing to do. Then you leak the information of the people that went there to cover the show, and a few months later, in a desperate attempt to cling back some of the audience you've lost, you propose the next Tomb Raider game is hosted on a tiny stage in the middle of the hall, while some TikToker does dances in this massive Palladium that takes up half the room. And well, by the time 2020 rolled around, you all know what happens next.
But the cry.
Yeah, I don't really feel like going into the whole deal about 2020. I'm fairly confident we have the same lived experience of it, unless you just came back from your chalet on the moon or something. However, where it affected E3 obviously was the fact that their dream of an all-singing, all-renegading E3 was dead. They would later confirm to Eurogamer that they had no time to plan a digital show, and I don't blame them. However, games were still going to come out. I mean, Jesus, the 1 year they cancel E3 is a hardware launch year. The companies had to find a way to get their information across, and thus began what many like to call Not E3. Microsoft started Not E3 in May with an event showcasing some Xbox Series X games. These events were originally supposed to run monthly, but they quickly backtracked on that after remembering that they didn't have any games to show. This was before they had Man-City'd Bethesda. Sony held an event on June 11th, a traditional E3 day, in which they showed off the PS5, new games, and one that you've already bought 3 times. This was a fine event, somewhat marred by the fact that a rumour started that the people hosting the show were actually being rendered inside of a PS5. This tragically turned out not to be the case. EA held its Not E3 EA Play, this time hosted by Glen Ellyn, Illinois' own Greg Miller. Look, I love Greg and I think he did a great job, but there was just something so soulless about this event. I don't know if it was the lack of crowd or the endless string of people just sitting in their living rooms, but it didn't feel right. But they announced a new skate, so beautiful, beautiful, stunning skate, amazing skate, can't believe it's so beautiful. Nintendo eventually held a direct in September, but in what was horrible timing, their plans for the huge 35th anniversary of Mario were disrupted. Although when they did get around to doing it, they put out 3D All-Stars, which, don't get me wrong, is one of the most important games ever and one of the best platformers ever, and Mario Sunshine, but it's just the games up-res a bit and put on Switch. And oh yeah, they were taking it off sale in less than a year. Nintendo, you know... Ubisoft held Ubisoft Forward, in which they cowardly refused to acknowledge the widespread abuse allegations that were ripping through the company. They even came forward before the event and issued the not at all well-aged statement, "Ubisoft Forward comes during a time of big internal change. Because of all the content has been pre-recorded, we wanted to recognise that the issues we're currently dealing with won't be addressed directly in the show. We still have significant work to do and are committed to the process. We will provide more updates soon." But at least Watch Dogs Legion looked cool, I suppose. Finally, we had Summer Games Fest, organised by the Game Awards creator and former Doritos salesman Jeff Keighley. Summer Games Fest was a 4-month-long livestream marathon that ran between May and August to fill the void of the cancellation of E3 and Gamescom. These were all totally fine streams and showed some cool new games, including the incredible Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2 remake and Game That Exists, Crash Bandicoot 4. But even then, as it was happening, look, I like Jeff Keighley. I think his passion for games is clear. He's sincere and positive. I think the Game Awards, if occasionally a bit too focused on adverts for games and not the actual awards, are a huge step forward to getting games the proper respect and treatment they deserve. I think he's a brilliant spokesperson for games. He seems like a very nice man, and honestly, if the future of E3 is a Jeff Keighley joint, I wouldn't be mad. However, Summer Games Fest, and I'm not being dramatic, is the worst thing that's ever happened to video games. Okay, that is a bit dramatic, but saying that Summer Games Fest eliminates the need for the kind of E3 that I loved and had always dreamed of going to, and it makes it all split up and not as unifying and not as cool and not as exciting, that's just not as snappy, is it? By providing another avenue for games to be shown, and a very good avenue, Jeff does a great job. It means there's competition between the ESA and Jeff Keighley to get the reveals. They're going to counter-program each other, and eventually it will get to a point where you have to pick between watching one or the other. And that's not what E3 should be about. There should be a schedule where you can watch everything. So as 2021 came limping into view and the world started to get vaccinated, events started to happen again. Noted fans of putting their audience in danger, the WWE held WrestleMania, which, while admittedly in front of a reduced crowd and a supposed mask enforcement, about 5 seconds into the first match, everyone's masks were chucked away like Mankind off the top of a Hell in a Cell. It seemed like E3 might happen. While the ESA as recently as April had told its partners that it hoped to have an in-person event, it was just a bit too soon. However, this time they were prepared for an online equivalent. This year, E3, now rebranded the Electronic Entertainment Experience, would be a virtual event in which fans, the media and industry members would be able to get the E3 experience from the comfort of their homes that they've been locked inside for a year and a half. Greg Miller, Jackie Ying and Alex Golden Boy Mendez were announced as hosts. With these announcements came the list of companies that would take part, and to be fair to E3, the gang was basically all here. However, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this means a return to 1 week in June where everything's packed together and all the world's video games share one focus. Oh no. As it stands, the current E3 schedule is... On June 9th, we have the Battlefield reveal that has been slowly leaking out for the past 10 years and is not a part of E3 or EA Play. On the 10th of June, Summer Game Fest kicks off in what they're calling a world premiere showcase announcements and a performance by Weezer. Then on June 11th, there will be the Koch Media Showcase. Later in the day, IGN will hold IGN Expo because we needed more events to show games. You guessed it, gameplay reveals and announcements. On the 12th, we've got Ubisoft Forward, which is apparently so packed they had to show Far Cry 6 as part of not E3. Also on the 12th, we have Devolver Digital and Wholesome Games, two things that certainly don't go together, RIP Dave Lang. We also have Gearbox on the 12th, in which Randy Pitchford will hopefully come out and perform some magic. On the 13th, we have the Look, we finally have games, Xbox and Bethesda Showcase, Warner Bros. Hogwarts Legacy Apology Hour, Square Enix apologising for delaying Final Fantasy VII 2 Remake into 2044, and the PC Gaming Show. I hope they announce Microsoft Excel too. The 14th is Take-Two and Capcom, which if Capcom were smart would just be an hour of showing an 8K model of the Vampire Woman, and on the 15th we've got Nintendo and Bandai Namco. And it doesn't just end in June. In July, you've got EGX Dresden, Virtual GDC, and EA Play Live, which is a whole month after the rest of everything else for no reason. And what about Summer Game Fest? Look at all the partners. What are they going to show? What is an IGN Expo? I don't get it. This is a bad way to do things. Look, I get it. Everyone wants their moment to shine. I understand developers not wanting to be part of a sizzle reel that's shown while the stream gets a shot of the crowd looking bored. But in doing this massive widespread approach where you need to have 3 TVs lined up to keep track of what is happening, it just makes me want none of it and wait for someone to wrap it up at the end of the day. Noted Danielle Partis lookalike Jeff Grubb literally set up a Discord to keep track of all this shit because it's such a mess. A game mess, if you will. As for the media, while some of the big boys have partnered with E3, for freelancers or smaller sites, they would expect it to go through a ridiculous application process that required, among other things, information the ESA doesn't need, and a business card saying where you work. I don't know if the ESA have noticed the general vibe, but I've not been handing out many business cards in the last year. As I'm recording this, not half an hour ago, I was accepted as media. What does that mean? Who can say? We'll find out, or will we? In the old days, it feels like there was a sense of unity. Everyone in games was laser focused on the same thing, and sure, there was always a few outlying streams that people missed, but now it feels like there's going to be an endless amount of games that are shown and never thought of again. Take Cuphead for example. When that was first shown at E3, it was jammed in the middle of one of those indie sizzle reels that companies love to use when they're short on real games, but it caught everyone's attention instantly. Did you see that weird old school Disney game? What the fuck was that? I guarantee if that was shown this year as part of Gaming Next, presented by LG and powered by Pepsi, it wouldn't make the mark it did as part of the big shows. Let me make myself very clear, I do not like the current style of E3 and wish it would go back to something closer to it was in the early 2010s. At the same time, I do not want the ESA in charge of it. They feel one step away from accidentally demolishing the hotel that all the journalists are staying in as part of an activation. I just want E3 to return to being one unified week where all the media and fans' focus is on games, not focusing on 6 different schedules that you need to cross-reference with 10 other websites in order to know what's going on. And here's how I would fix it. Obvious disclaimer, I don't actually know how to run an event, so consider this fantasy booking. E3 2022. First of all, borrowing from Gamescom, make the first 2 days of the show media only. This will allow the press to get their work done, attend their appointments, and get everything sorted before the absolute mass of humanity makes it through the door. Gamescom does this, and while it's slightly more necessary because the amount of people that go to Gamescom is larger than most towns, it's a better environment for everyone. Secondly, have one body, whether it be the ESA or Keighley or someone else, sit down and schedule the show so that the press conferences take place during the day LA time so the rest of the world can watch them, and they don't overlap with anything else. Not only this, at the show, set up huge theatres showing the conferences and include that in the price of the ticket, and let it be a place for people to go absolutely crazy at these announcements together. My favourite part about PSX was hearing the absolute diehards lose their mind simply from seeing the Fireflies logo and realising that it was a trailer for The Last of Us Part 2. Back when I literally didn't know anyone that watched E3, I remember watching announcements like that and having the hairs on my arms stand up. I couldn't celebrate with anyone, so I just sat there and shook with the excitement, maybe tweeting, "Holy fucking shit, can you believe they're making another Fallout? There's no way it could be bad." If I were to bet, I think those kind of announcements, those huge pops, the big reveals, is actually what E3 is about for most people. Sure, getting to go and play a bit of the game is also cool. Feeling like you're in the industry is intoxicating, especially for people that want to eventually make that their job, and God help you. But when E3 is like a sport to people, people should be able to watch it with the rest of the supporters. Look, it's arguably a bit cringy when Xbox gets the biggest fans all to wear the same shirt and sit them in the front of the audience to ensure huge reactions, but fuck it, they love Xbox. I'm sure those people are genuinely losing their mind. That should be the vibe for E3 for people who buy public tickets on those days. They're not going to get into the conferences, so at least make them feel like they're there in spirit by being part of a big audience. Next, when you open the show, and remember by this point the press have left, have more booths for people to play games, and while that's happening, be showing on screens everywhere a live feed of the stage show that's happening at that moment. Let's say it's Jeff Keighley interviewing the devs of a game that's just been announced in the previous 2 days. So even when people are waiting around for hours, they have something to watch. It's a small thing, but it would pass the time much faster than watching the same trailer over and over again. And lastly, no influencer activations. No one's going to E3 for that. If you're into games enough to know what E3 is, there's no way that the decision of whether or not to drop $250 is hanging on what TikToker you could watch playing Warzone. That stuff always falls flat in its face. You know how it goes when celebrities get involved in E3. Don't make us tell you again.
I am here to talk about Need for Speed Payback. If you guys didn't know, Need for Speed Payback,
Look, this is very idealistic. There's always going to be some people that don't want to play nicely with it. Jim, get out! There are no old games in here for you to ruin. Leave! Sorry about him, folks. But the ESA have proven they can get most of the big boys to be in the same room. If they combine that with Jeff Keighley's ability to be a frontman for the games industry like he is, I feel like we can go back to something that feels special. It's very easy to be jaded by E3. The way some of the game press talk about it sounds like you're going to have your balls kicked for a week straight, and sure, after your personal information gets leaked, you'd probably feel the same, so I don't blame them, but part of my brain is still just a die-hard fan of games. Irrespective of my place in the press, I still love the idea of E3. If you want evidence of how special E3 still is to fans, go to the comments of just about every press conference for the past few years. There will be new comments every couple of days from people rewatching the event to relive the excitement. Yes, look, they're adverts, okay? We get it, capitalism bad, I agree, but I would much rather have an E3 that's a great experience for the person who sits and watches the Final Fantasy VII Remake trailer and cries than someone who is jaded by the whole experience. But I suppose, for this year, all we have is the game mess. There's a part of me that worries that I'm just being nostalgic for a version of E3 that wouldn't work nowadays, and I only like it because it was the way E3 was when I was 13 and 14, before this was my job. E3 feels like the last week of term to me, and not just because sometimes it literally fell on the last week of term, but it felt like an end cap for games. Sure, you would get some things coming out in June, like Last of Us a couple of years ago, but after that, it was see it Madden. What games came out in July? Name me a game that comes out in July. It feels like the biggest game of the next few years could be announced on a stream that we're given 6 hours warning for. I miss the old E3. It was flawed, sometimes very, very flawed, dangerously so, but I'm sad that unless something changes, it's very unlikely that I'll be able to visit the E3 that I imagined when I was 13 as a member of the press. In fact, if the world hadn't ended, this was probably the year it was going to happen. So part of it is that I won't get to walk the show floor and bump into Greg Miller or say hello to Hideo Kojima in a toilet at a publisher party, but I know there could be a better E3, and hopefully by the time that the yellow and black army of Overlode rock up to Los Angeles, there will be.
I am here to talk about Need for Speed Payback. If you guys didn't know, Need for Speed Payback,
Thanks for watching this eulogy of E3. Even saying all of this, I am excited for E3 2021. I have my media badge ready. I have some cool appointments booked. I think there will be good games shown. It just doesn't feel as special as it normally does because it's so spread out. By this time every other year, I would know exactly when things were. I could tell you times and dates and when they were in UK time because it was usually 2 in the morning, but now maybe I'm just getting old, maybe I just need a calendar. Let me know what you think about E3 and if you like this modern version because it democratizes it a wee bit. You don't have to go to LA, or do you prefer the bombastic E3, the classic E3, the E3 that was the goal for so many? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, please consider supporting Overlode on patreon.com/overlode, where you can get exclusive access to Patreon only video series. All of our videos that aren't embargoed go up early over there, and there's lots more too. Until next time, I'm Jordan Midler. See you later. Support for Overlode is provided by our incredible patrons. To support us and receive access to perks and exclusives such as Patreon only video series, check out patreon.com/overlode or click the link in the description. Thank you.